I am Peter MacArthur, 1150 a.m. WDEL. We come to you live from Widener University School of Law this morning, a packed house for our commute with the candidates between Republican Christine O'Donnell and Democrat Chris Coons, who are entering the room as we speak. How about a nice round of applause for our candidates as they enter with us? At this time, I'd like to introduce also our panelists for today's debate. From Delaware Today magazine, Mark Nardone. Also from the News Journal, Chad Livengood. From WPVI, Channel 6 in Philadelphia, anchor Tamela Edwards. And WDEL's own Alan Loudell. A quick rundown of our rules for the morning. There will be no opening statements. In just a moment, one of our panelists will ask a question, and each candidate will have 60 seconds for an initial response. Once each has answered, we have what we call a crossfire round. That's an opportunity for the candidates to dialogue further on an issue, and the moderator will determine when we move on to a new question. We'd like to cover as much ground as we possibly can in this next 90 minutes. Also, we will have an opportunity for the candidates to present closing remarks at the end of the debate. Our first question, plus a welcoming statement from our hosts here at Widener, coming up in just a moment. Just a reminder, WDEL's Election Watch coverage brought to you by Shell Horn & Hill. Before it hits, get on top of winter with the reliability of Shell Horn & Hill. Call 658-5293. Do it today. WDEL News Time, 8:03.
All right, this is a 60-second break. Christine, we're going to flip for closing statements. Heads is one. Heads is Tails is O'Donnell. Okay. You go first. I'll go first and close the first. Any time signal? Yeah. What, 15 or 30? Both. I'd ask Christine as well. I do 30 and 50. I do both. 30. It's going to be 30 and 15. 30, 15? 30 and 15.
Okay. So we have 30 seconds to respond?
No, 2 minutes, but we'll tell you on 30.
Okay.
You sure it's 2? Or some of the rules said for I'm closing statements? No, well, closing statements too, like answers to questions. I'm not sure. 2 minutes is good. Sure. Follow whatever rules you got.
And welcome back to WDEL's Commute with the Candidates. We want to remind you that you can see live video of this on our website, WDEL.com. We have a live stream happening as we speak. Before we get to our first question of the debate between U.S. Senate candidates Christine O'Donnell and Chris Coons, I would like to ask the audience, this obviously is quite a monumental morning. Please, though, let's hold applause and outbursts until the end of the session here so we can cover as much ground as possible. Right now, I would like to present Mary Allen. She is Public Relations Officer of Widener University School of Law for an opening welcome remark.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of our Law Dean, Linda Ammons, and all the students, faculty, and staff watching and listening with her here today in the Ruby R. Vale Moot Courtroom, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this debate between Mr. Coons and Ms. O'Donnell. As Delaware's law school, we encourage free thinking and open exchanges of ideas that examine government, policy, and most importantly, the Constitution. And so it is with great pride that we once again partner with WDEL in the spirit of public service to provide this forum where voters can learn more about the candidates from the candidates themselves. I thank the journalists who are here today posing the questions, and everyone watching on WDEL.com, on television, here in person, and those listening over their radios. Widener Law is glad you've chosen to spend part of your day with us. And to the candidates, I say good luck.
Thank you very much, Mary. Let's now move on. We are going to go to our first question, and I just want to remind the candidates 60 seconds for an initial response. I will give you hand cues at 30 seconds and 15 seconds so you can wind down the responses appropriately, because again, we want to cover as much ground and as many topics as possible. So if you can lend a little peripheral over here, I'll get you set up on that situation. Let's start the questioning now with WDEL's own Alan Loudell.
Good morning, candidates. We're in a law school. If you're a senator, you may have to pass judgment on a Supreme Court nominee. So in that spirit, I've got some legal questions. We all know by now that Chris Coons and Christine O'Donnell differ profoundly on Roe v. Wade, the decision on abortion. Let's go farther back, 65, Griswold versus Connecticut. in which the Supreme Court justices at the time found that the Constitution protected a right to privacy as the justices struck down a Connecticut ban on contraception. Is there a right to marital privacy in the Constitution? And to Ms. O'Donnell in particular, would that be an example of justices extrapolating too much, legislating from the bench?
No, I don't think that's an example of too much legislation from the bench. I don't think that the courts or Congress should legislate what a married couple does.
Mr. Liddell, thanks for a chance to be with you this morning. It's great to be back here at Widener Law School. Of course, I would support Griswold versus Connecticut. It is a long-settled part of American constitutional law. And I think that the justices who worked hard in that particular decision to find a right to privacy and then later expounded on it and provided the foundation for Roe versus Wade, interpreted the Constitution in a modern context in a way that fulfills the early promise of the founders and that now provides a decades-old protection to a zone of marital privacy that is important to the foundation of individual liberty and the relationships that we try and uphold and protect in our constitutional democracy.
Okay, well then as a follow-up, what to you would be an example of extrapolating too much from the Constitution?
Well, you mentioned Roe versus Wade. That's one decision that I think ignores the Constitution, not just the right to protect life, but also the state's rights. As I mentioned in our other debate, overturning Roe versus Wade would not make abortion legal across the country. It would return the power back to the states. Other decisions are Kelo. I don't think that the government has a right to dictate what someone does with their private property. But also to clarify the remarks that were taken out of context in our CNN debate, under a justice who is a strict constitutionalist, both in Roberts and Rehnquist, there have been very few recent Supreme Court decisions with which I've disagreed. So I would say that I think that this court is on the right track.
Mr. Coons, anything further?
Obviously, there are some decisions I disagree with fairly strongly that the recent court has handed down. One other I'd give as an example is Ledbetter versus Goodyear. Others where I think the court was legislating from the bench, to use a phrase you used before, Bush v. Gore, where I think the court explicitly says this decision will have no precedent. And they were simply trying, in my view, to reach an outcome in a political case. And I think that was an inappropriate judicial intervention in the resolution of an election. Ledbetter versus Goodyear led to the very first law signed into law by the current president, which returned, I think, the real protections for equal pay for women for equal work. And it was a decision poorly decided and in a way that really deprived women from the protections of the Civil Rights Act that said that you could not be given disparate pay based on difference in gender. I'm really struck by Ms. O'Donnell's answer. You can't have Roe versus Wade without Griswold versus Connecticut, and so I think there's just some real tension in her answer today.
Would we care to elaborate now? We do have the opportunity now to do what we call the crossfire round, which is basically a chance for you two to debate further on an issue without the confines of the 60-second rule. Is there anything further you'd like to add, Ms. O'Donnell, to start?
No, simply I think that Roe versus Wade is ignoring the 10th Amendment's right for state sovereignty. I don't think that there's any tension in my remarks. And, you know, as someone who studied at Yale, perhaps they didn't teach you constitutional law at Yale Divinity School, but I think it's a very clear violation of the 10th Amendment, of the state's rights to determine what is in the best interest of their citizens.
Griswold versus Connecticut is a case that finds a right to privacy. And in your first answer, Ms. O'Donnell, you said, there's nothing wrong with Griswold versus Connecticut. I would have no difference with it, no challenge. And if you understand the foundation of Roe versus Wade, you would have to also reject Griswold versus Connecticut. It is in some ways even more of a reach than Roe versus Wade to those who claim to understand and uphold a strict constitutionalist view. I oppose that. I differ. I have a different view of the Constitution, as does the vast majority of the American public and many current legal scholars. But the larger point, Ms. O'Donnell, really, is that you're not coming clean with the Delaware voters about what your real views are. As we saw in the CNN debate, you repeatedly ran away from answering clear, concise questions, whether from the moderators, from me, from students, to be clear about what your views are on a range of very important issues on which you would have to pass as a U.S. Senator. To say, for example, that it's really a question of local control, whether a school district teaches science or teaches religious doctrine misses the basic question.
Well,
As a
let me-
repeated candidate for the United States Senate, you have made public statements on everything from choice, individual liberty, evolution, and others that I do think our voters deserve to hear a clear answer from you about.
Great, let me clarify your remarks. Mr. Loudell's question was about marriage, not necessarily about the so-called right to privacy. Now, you say that you have a different view of the Constitution. I would agree with you that you do have a different Constitution, because in the CNN debate, you stated that there were 3 constitutions. And you don't need to go to any kind of Ivy League school to know that we have but one Constitution. And in all of my remarks, it is said that that one Constitution is the Constitution that I will defend. I've made my positions very clear. Everybody knows where I stand on issues, but even where I stand on certain social issues, I will defend our constitutional right to disagree, and I have made that very clear. Our Constitution is not in opposition to my personal beliefs, and it's not in opposition to someone who might have a different position on these social issues than I do. Our Constitution protects our freedom to disagree.
That's right, and I'm grateful for this chance to continue to disagree. I just hope you'll come clean with the folks of this state and the listeners to this debate
I have
about
come
what
clean
your
on
real
every
views
position.
are.
I've
Well,
come-
then answer the question, do you believe in evolution?
What I think about the theory of evolution is irrelevant, because I will defend.
Again, you're
a
dodging
local-
the simple question.
What
It's a
is my-
settled scientific
Now, listen,
fact.
let me ask you, what is the relevance on that, other than campaigning on Sunday mornings, which you tend to do, going to the churches and, do you disagree with the positions that those several churches that you've been attending? I mean,
I
are you gonna
believe
tell
that
them you're
I
gonna
believe
show up just
churches
to get
have
their
the
votes?
absolute right to believe whatever religious doctrine they wish
And do
to.
local schools
But you
have the
cannot
right to
impose
teach
the
that?
they do not. Public
Local
schools,
do not have the right
do
to
not.
teach what they feel. Well, there you go.
Religious
Do you want
doctrine
a
does
senator
not
who's gonna
belong in our
impose his
public schools.
beliefs? Talk about imposing your beliefs on the local schools.
Right.
I'm saying that if a local community wants to teach the theory of evolution, it's up to the school board to decide. But when I made those remarks, it was because the school board wanted to also teach the theory of intelligent design, and the government said that they could not. You have
That's right.
just stated that you will impose your will over the local school district, and that is a blatant violation of our Constitution.
And to be
Do you
clear,
want a
Ms.
senator
O'Donnell,
who's gonna do that?
to be clear, Ms. O'Donnell, I believe that creationism is religious doctrine and that
How about the
evolution is
theory of
broadly
intelligent
accepted.
design?
Creationism, which you'd
Theory
like
of
to call the
intelligent
theory of
design.
intelligent design, is religious
No, two
doctrine.
different things.
Evolution is widely accepted, well-defended scientific fact. And our schools should be teaching science. If we want to instruct our children in religious doctrine or religious practice, as my wife and I choose to, that's wonderful. That's what our churches are for. And that's what private or parochial schools are for. But our public schools should be teaching broadly accepted scientific fact, not religious doctrine.
Well, you've just proved how little you know, not just about constitutional law, but about the theory of evolution. Because the theory of evolution is not a fact, it is indeed a theory, but I'm saying that that theory, if local school districts want to give that theory equal credence to intelligent design, it is their right. You are saying it is not their right.
That's right.
That is what has gotten our country into this position, is the overreaching arm of the federal government getting into the business of the local communities. The Supreme Court has always said it is up to the local communities to decide their standards. The reason we're in the mess we're in is because our so-called leaders in Washington no longer view the indispensable principles of our founding as truly that, indispensable. We're
And
supposed
one
to
of
have
those
limited
indispensable
government,
principles,
low taxation.
Ms.
All right,
O'Donnell,
candidates,
Ms.
I'm
O'Donnell,
sorry.
one of those indispensable principles is the separation of church and state.
Okay, with that, very good dialogue. We appreciate that. Let's, though, move on so we can get to all the panelists and cover a number of areas. Chad Livengood from the News Journal, please, if you could ask the next
what-
question, please.
Where in the Constitution is separation of church and state?
It's in, no, an excellent point.
Hold on, please. Let's have some respect for the panelists and the questions they brought today and let them dictate a little bit, at least, on where we go with this, okay?
Well,
Thank you.
we're just going to stay on the Constitution theme here. Ms. O'Donnell, you have said that the Constitution will be a litmus test for how you'll vote in the Senate. There have been a lot of changes to the Constitution since it was ratified 223 years ago. Some Republicans and Tea Party members have called for repeal of some constitutional amendments. What are your thoughts about repealing the 14th, the 16th, and the 17th Amendments?
17th Amendment I would not repeal. That's the amendment that puts the power to, for the state government to determine who represents you in Washington. I support that. I mean, I support the free election process of that. If you can, I'm sorry I didn't bring my Constitution with me. Fortunately, senators don't have to memorize the Constitution. What, can you remind me of what the other ones are?
14th Amendment defines citizenship, and the 16th Amendment, I think you should know what the 16th Amendment is. Federal income tax?
Okay. No, I support lowering the income tax, but that amendment gives the Congress the power to tax. Now, I, of all people, want to reform the IRS. I do believe that we desperately need tax reform. Citizenship, you're talking about illegal immigration. I think that we have to close the borders before we discuss any sort of amnesty or DREAM Act or anything in terms of, but our country has always welcomed people from other lands. We are a magnet because people want to come over and pursue the American dream. But we have made it harder and harder to do exactly that when it comes to taxation and overregulation that has strayed from the original principles.
That's time, Ms. O'Donnell. Thank you. Mr. Coons.
A great question, Chad. Thank you. Of course, I would uphold the 14th, 16th, and 17th Amendments to the Constitution. And I think it is exactly one of the real challenges in this election season to the public, to our voters, that the Tea Party and folks who ask us to consider repealing these central amendments raises. And it's part of why I really hope that listeners are paying close attention to the answers you're hearing today and to the principles and values that both of the candidates in front of you are laying out. What I think Delaware voters want to hear about today is jobs, the economy moving forward. But a senator also has to understand the Constitution, be able to interpret it and apply it, and vote on Supreme Court justices. I absolutely oppose the widespread proposals by Tea Party candidates for us to repeal the 14th, 16th, or 17th Amendments. I also think you've just heard in the answers from my opponent and in her attempt at saying, where is the separation of church and state in the Constitution, reveals her fundamental misunderstanding of what our Constitution is, how it is amended, and how it evolves. The First Amendment establishes the separation, the fact that the federal government shall not establish any religion, and decisional law by the Supreme Court over many, many decades clarifies and enshrines that there is a separation of church and state that our courts and our laws must respect.
So you're
back to the Roe versus Wade.
Back to Roe versus Wade.
Back to Roe versus Wade and the Griswold question earlier. The zone of privacy is something that the Supreme Court interpreted the Bill of Rights and several of those amendments to create. It is important for us in modern times to apply the Constitution, in my view, as it exists today and as it's been interpreted by our justices. And if there are settled pieces of constitutional law, like the separation of church and state, like the individual right to reproductive freedom that Roe versus Wade represents, that we've lived with and have lived under for decades, in my view, it is important to know whether you have on my side a candidate who believes and supports those things, and on the other side, a candidate who's both unfamiliar with and does not support those things.
You're telling me that the separation of church and state is found in the First Amendment.
Government shall make no establishment of religion.
That's in the First Amendment.
All right, 8:15 here on 1150 a.m. WDEL. You are listening to a live debate. We are at Widener University School of Law this morning between U.S. Senate candidates Chris Coon and Christine O'Donnell. And let's move on to another question now. Mark Nardone, Delaware Today.
I think you both position yourself as pretty independent thinkers. And if this election is about anything, it's about dissatisfaction with the current leadership. So I'd like to know, or would you please give us one or two examples where you agree with your party's leadership and where you think you differ with your party's leadership?
Mr. Coons, why don't you start this time?
I've given several examples in the past. I'm going to assume, in my case, you mean my party's leadership. You intend the president and vice president, the current administration. I've disagreed with the administration on their proposal to open the Outer Continental Shelf to oil drilling. Delaware has among the nation's most spectacular beaches, and I think both tourism and fishing are important parts of our state and its history. And I think offshore oil drilling, although there are some who support it strongly, like I believe my opponent, because they think we need to drill wherever we can. What was the mantra? I think drill, baby, drill. I oppose that, and that's something that I opposed our administration on. I support some of the major progress that has been made in restoring our economy to health. The current president inherited the worst economic situation we've had since the Great Depression. Very bad decisions made by the previous administration led to record deficits, mounting federal debt, a collapse in the financial services sector, and then ultimately a collapse in our broader economy, and nearly a collapse in the global economy. And I support the tough steps that they took to restore, to put a floor under the collapse in our economy.
All right, Mr. Coons, thank you. Ms. O'Donnell.
Well, first of all, I want to point out that my opponent has consistently flip-flopped on his whether or not he will be a rubber stamp for the Obama-Reid agenda. One of the things that is hurting our economy right now is the uncertainty, and he can't even give us a level of certainty on how he'll vote on one of the most important votes the next U.S. Senator for Delaware will be casting this November, and that's on the massive tax hikes that are going to come in January. He's taking 4 different positions publicly, 5 if you include what he said in private fundraising letters. So there's a reason why the administration is pulling out all stops to get him elected, and there's a reason why Harry Reid has called him my pet. Now, I think that when you look at what I've done, I've had to fight my own party for the opportunity to be on this stage, and in some extent, I'm still fighting my own party. He's got the Democratic Senatorial Committee running attack ads against me. Even after he said he wasn't going to go nasty, he's never publicly asked them to take down their slanderous ads.
All right, that's fine. We can dialogue further here, but Mr. Coons would like to start by answering to any of the things that Ms. O'Donnell just said.
Well, I think Ms. O'Donnell and I both have an obligation to be truthful with the audience today, and what Ms. O'Donnell just said flat out isn't. Let me be clear about my position on the extension of the Bush income tax cuts, because I've taken a consistent position and followed this position in every public statement. One of the challenges when you try to give an answer that's got any complexity or nuance is my opponent characterizes it as flip-flops or lies. So let me be clear about where I stand. We should extend the income tax cuts that were enacted a decade ago for 98% of the American public. That's the president's current position, up to $250,000. And so I would extend the Bush tax cuts at least to the 98% of our population level, which is broadly endorsed by fellow Democrats running for office and in office. I would consider extending them further to higher income levels, and I would consider extending them for shorter periods. But in my view, whether we extend them for 2 or 3 years or extend them for 10 years ought to be balanced against what other tax cuts we can and should come to an agreement with in a balanced bipartisan way.
I'll remind you of your position.
Well, I'm going to finish stating my position before you start saying I'm lying and mischaracterizing it. So I'm going to simply finish my statement about what my position is.
Well, you said that you had...
I've said over and over that the simple value that I will apply is whether or not the simple value I will apply in deciding what additional extensions of tax cuts to offer is what has the best chance of putting people back to work. What has the best chance of getting our economy started again?
Thank you for being a
So
gentleman.
whether we're going to have a research and development tax credit, a small business tax credit, a home office exemption expansion, I think all has to be weighed with what further exacerbates the deficit and the debt.
Okay.
Ms. O'Donnell.
Now,
Ms. O'Donnell.
your 4 different positions on ABC's this week, you said that you would vote to extend the overwhelming majority, but then on CNN you said that you don't think that we should draw this arbitrary line, and then you've had a couple other different positions, and
Exactly.
you've had fundraising
And as I
letters
just
where you
said
said that you would support this administration. Now let me finish.
Okay.
You wouldn't let
Happy
me
to.
interrupt to get my point in. Now when you say that you support extending or cutting, increasing the taxes on the top 2%, you are blatantly ignoring that the small business owners fall under that. If you were intellectually honest and do want to do what is best for stopping the debt, for getting jobs, then you would stop all of these tax increases that are going to come in January, because in this economy, it is not the time to raise taxes on anyone, small business owners or the upper income job creators. When you decrease taxes, revenue increases. It happened under Kennedy, it happened under Reagan, so this is not a partisan position. This is what Economics 101 will teach you that happened under a Democrat president and a Republican president. But when Carter raised taxes, It caused massive inflation, massive debt. If you want to do that, then by all means, continue to run our economy into the ground the way you have here in Newcastle County, where unemployment has doubled under your watch, where by 2014, some reports are showing if we continue to tax and spend at the rate that you have done, Newcastle County will be bankrupt. You raise taxes on low-income seniors, you raise taxes on low-income disabled, giving the most vulnerable in our society an economic disadvantage, and you brag about balancing the budget, but you've balanced the budget by raising taxes and depleting the surplus fund.
Okay.
We don't need any more of that in Washington, D.C.
Ms. O'Donnell, the News Journal has repeatedly, publicly reviewed and discredited and disproven several of the things you just said. I think today's debate, we need to focus on what I believe the Delawareans in this audience and listening to us today want to hear, which is not your repeat of previous misstatements, falsehoods, and misleading comments, but rather, what's our positive agenda for moving forward?
We've launched something called fact-checking the News Journal's fact check, and Chad can attest that we've given him all of the documentation to prove that what they claim to be mostly true and mostly false is indeed true. So, Chad, whether or not you choose to report on that documentation is up to you. But we have also posted it all on our website, Christine2010.com. So I would encourage people to go look at the facts instead of what the News Journal reports.
All right, let's move on. We're getting sidetracked here, I feel. Tamela Edwards from WPVI came a long way to see you folks, so we'd like to let her ask her question this morning. Tamela.
Good morning to both of you. As you know, being a senator is a position of leadership, so let's talk about that a little bit. And Mr. O'Donnell, in a previous debate, Mr. Coons said you have plenty of slogans, but not solutions. And as well, I'm sure you saw Meghan McCain and other Republicans take you on a little bit in terms of what is your background, your success, your experience. Can you give us 3 examples of initiatives, efforts, or projects that show your success as a leader?
60 seconds.
Absolutely, I can give you well more than 3. Let me first address the issue of experience. I've spent over 10 years working in Washington, directly impacting legislation. I have more experience directly working with federal legislation than my opponent does. A graduate fellowship in constitutional government. When it comes to specific things that I would like to do, I want to propose a temporary 2-year tax holiday on the capital gains tax so that businesses have immediate capital that they need to reinvest. I'm proposing that we let all of the tax cuts be extended so that none of the tax increases happen on any sector of our society. Number 3, what I want to do to immediately create jobs is permanently eliminate the death tax. That's going to be reinstated on January 1st, and we don't need it. It's going to, you look like you have a question.
I'm sorry, Peter, I do want to cut in. I understand you're talking about what you want to do, but I don't think you're answering my question of what have you done specifically?
All right, well, look at the fact that I'm up here in the first place. It is my leadership that has taken on my party's leadership. My candidacy has inspired a groundswell of grassroots support that extends across partisan lines. We had an event last night where the majority of the people in the audience were indeed Democrats who said, I just cannot, in this economy with good conscience, vote for our county executive. So if you look at the success of my campaign, that proves my leadership skills. Leadership is not determined in if you ever fall, but whether or not you get up. I'm someone who knows how hard it is
That's
to
time,
earn
Ms.
and keep
O'Donnell. I'm
above.
sorry. We can again elaborate further. Do we direct the same question to Mr. Coons?
I could do a different question for Mr. Coons, or
Go right ahead.
stay on the same topic.
Go right ahead.
I mean, Ms. Edwards, I do think I have a long and substantive record of leadership in the public sector, and I appreciate the question. I'm happy to move on to another question, though.
Okay, let's go on to your divinity degree from Yale was raised at one point. Let's talk about that a little bit because you talked about the separation of church and state, but where do you see the appropriate role of faith-based organizations in government?
60 seconds.
I do think that faith-based organizations provide broad, critical, effective, innovative relief to human suffering and to human needs. But I think we need to draw a careful line. Anytime a faith-based organization is involved in proselytizing, in outreach, in the teaching of religious doctrine, they should not be doing that with federal dollars. and frankly, on behalf of faith-related organizations with which I've served and volunteered, they have to choose very carefully how close to get to public dollars, because with public dollars comes public scrutiny, comes public accountability, and an entanglement that I don't think is appropriate. So, for example, when I was a student intern pastor with the Downtown Cooperative Ministry in New Haven, we were providing food and help and support to the homeless in New Haven, which is one of the poorest cities in New England. We didn't accept public funds at that time, and I think for a faith-based organization to accept public funds is the beginning of a difficult entanglement. I do think it is appropriate, and there are times and places when we can use public dollars to support the provision of public relief, public benefits, public services through faith-based organizations. But you have to carefully police that line and make sure they're not using those resources for proselytizing or for teaching of religious doctrine.
Ms. O'Donnell, would you like 60 seconds to add anything to that?
I think that nonprofit organizations and NGOs play a great role in our society. The people who serve in the nonprofit organizations are the ones who are committed to a cause greater than themselves. For nearly 20 years, I have worked as an advocate consulting for many nonprofit organizations. And I would also agree that we need to be careful about giving federal dollars to organizations. However, there is a role that certain nonprofit organizations can play, and I think that there's a misnomer that he spoke of, that all nonprofit organizations are faith-based. Faith plays a very important role in our society, yet we cannot dictate what faith anybody has, and our Constitution does protect that.
Anything further, Mr. Coons?
I'll simply say that those who are listening today know I did not just say that all nonprofits are faith-based. One of the challenges I think we face is to keep in this dialogue and this debate moving forward in a positive and constructive way. And so I'm not going to simply devolve into a agree-disagree. I have long experience serving with many nonprofits, with the Coalition for the Homeless, with the I Have a Dream Foundation, with the South African Council of Churches, with the Downtown Cooperative Ministry I mentioned. Two of them were explicitly rooted in a shared faith. Two of them were not. And I think lots and lots of great services in our community are provided by nonprofit organizations, both those that are rooted in a religious faith and those that are not, that are non-sectarian.
Can I ask you a question, Chris? Can you name the 5 freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment?
I think the very first provision of the First Amendment is that the government shall make no establishment of religion. And before we get into a further debate about exactly which of us knows the Constitution better, how about we get the panel asking our questions today?
I guess it can't.
All right, 8:32 here on 1150 a.m. WDEL, live from Widener University School of Law this morning as we hold a debate between the candidates for U.S. Senate in Delaware, Christine O'Donnell and Democrat Chris Coons. Our panelists this morning, Mark Nardone from Delaware Today, Tamela Edwards from ABC 6 Action News, Alan Loudell from WDEL, and Chad Livengood from the News Journal. And the next question goes to Alan Loudell.
Peter, who responds first to the next question? That will determine which question I ask. Ms. O'Donnell or Mr. Coons?
That's a great question.
Okay. Well,
hard to believe, but I've lost track.
All right. Well, how about a Ms. O'Donnell gets the first whack at this? U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said publicly last month that the U.S. Constitution does not, in fact, bar sex discrimination, that the 14th Amendment does not necessarily apply. Considering that Justice Scalia is presumably the sort of justice that Christine O'Donnell would favor, were he up, and Mr. Coons would oppose, in retrospect, would it be against the spirit of constitutional originalism for Christine O'Donnell to have filed her gender discrimination wrongful termination lawsuits against your former employer, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute?
All right, 60 seconds, Ms. O'Donnell.
Well, my case never made it to the Supreme Court, so I don't know how Justice Scalia would rule on that. I'd need to read his remarks, but I absolutely do think that gender is one of the discriminations that we are protected against, and obviously, I support women's rights, and I'm opposed to any kind of gender discrimination.
So if I can interrupt, you're to the left of Justice Scalia on that then, huh?
Well, I'd have to read his remarks, but yeah. I mean, I'm not, unlike my opponent, I'm not someone who rubber stamps the conservative agenda. And I've gotten flack for that. I got a lot of flack from Republicans for saying that I admire Hillary Clinton. But I do. I admire any woman who holds her own in a male-dominated environment, and any woman who has paved the way. I consider myself a feminist. Ist means one who celebrates, and I celebrate my femininity. I think that the differences between men and women are a beautiful thing, and we can enter into, whether it's politics or the business world, without having to become like a man, but use our gifts in a unique way that only a woman can.
Mr. Coons, 60 seconds to you.
Could you reframe the question, Alan, so it's relevant?
Well, again, Anna and Scalia, who of course is probably, along with Clarence Thomas, one of the originalists in their thinking, says that the U.S. Constitution does not, in fact, bar sex discrimination. 14th Amendment does not necessarily apply. Talk about, I guess, for you, in terms of if you're questioning a Supreme Court nominee and had a Republican president, how you would go about trying to ascertain a would-be justice's views on that.
Well, there's a whole long line of decisions by the Supreme Court, now well settled, that interpret and that both use the 14th Amendment to apply to the state's interpretations of individual liberties, and that then interpret things like the Civil Rights Act, Title VII in particular. I am someone, as I've said repeatedly in this campaign, who believes that we can and should make more progress, for example, by repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, in ensuring that the civil liberties, civil rights, the opportunities for individuals in our country to express themselves fully are protected by our courts and are not unduly restrained by practices or policies. I would ask questions of a potential justice, of a potential senator, about which decisions they agree with, which they would disagree with, how they would have reached that decision, and sort of what values and what personal experiences they would bring to the bench. At the end of the day, I think the future of our Constitution and our constitutional order hangs in the balance. We have a very closely divided court. Most of the major decisions of the last 20 years have been made by one justice. And I think it's important for us to continue to ensure that we have Supreme Court justices who will uphold the commitment to individual liberty that's enshrined in a lot of the law following Title VII.
Would you like to add anything further, Ms. O'Donnell, or shall we move on to another question?
We can move on.
Chad Livengood from the News Journal. It is your floor, sir.
Mr. Coons, in a television ad, Ms. O'Donnell says, quote, "I didn't inherit millions like my opponent." Will you please address what inheritance you have occurred as a member of the Gore family?
Great question, Chad. I was very surprised that my opponent chose to attack my family and me for being very successful business people. My stepfather started a business in the basement of his home with his parents, and along with hundreds of other hardworking, innovative Delawareans. Over decades, our family business, the business that's owned by everybody who works there, and many members of my extended family, has become an incredibly successful and competitive business. It's rooted in Newark, Delaware, and it's rooted in the creativity and the innovation of dozens, now today thousands, of folks from Delaware, from Maryland, from across this country and around the world, who bring their skills, their freedom, their individual talent to bear to make the Gore Company very successful. I worked there for 8 years. One of the best things about the Gore Company is that everybody who works there, everybody of whatever role, whatever place within the company, earns stock in the company, and the company is owned overwhelmingly by the folks who work there. So I was stunned that a Republican candidate would make that sort of, in my view, snide personal attack on a family that has been extremely successful in business.
All right,
in my
that's
view,
time.
it is exactly the
You must
hope
be-
that other
you
families
said
can be
time.
successful that
You
is our
said
point
time.
here.
Let's do
You
this.
must be very sensitive about the fact that you stand to make a lot of money from cap and trade to think me simply saying, "I didn't make millions" is a snide remark. Simply, that's an indictment on my financial status, because you have started to run ads that specifically name my mother. I mean, so talk about snide, talk about bringing family, and I simply said, I didn't inherit millions like my opponent. You
Ms.
brought
O'Donnell,
my
it is exactly
mother
that difference
into-
between earning
Wait,
and
don't I have
inheriting
a-
that is.
don't I
She-
have a
yes, you have.
minute
You go right ahead.
uninterrupted? Thank
right
you.
ahead.
Your campaign ads drag my mother into it because for 7 months, we paid her as our bookkeeper $3,000. I don't think that there is anything wrong with that other than we paid her too little to work as our bookkeeper. Now, you stated that the people invested in Gore do get shares, so you are then admitting that you personally stand to make a lot of money from the passage of cap and trade, as you did other environmental policies that your company lobbied for. Your company also got nearly $1 million in stimulus funds. So because of that, if elected, would you recuse yourself from voting on cap and trade? Would you recuse yourself from voting on more stimulus funds that raise our taxes, that hurt those of us who did not inherit millions of dollars, but give your company business?
Our chance now to dialogue further on this. I'm guessing, Mr. Coons, you'd like to respond to that?
What matters to the people of Delaware is which of us as a senator has the experience, the grounding, the ideas, and the understanding to move this economy forward. And I think the 8 years that I worked hard at Gore, and I think the experience and values that I learned there, makes me, of the two of us, qualified to make the hard decisions that stand in front of us. As anyone who has served both in the private sector and the public sector knows, it is appropriate for folks to pass legislation that is broadly positive for the broad economy. Let me give you an example so we can help get to a fact pattern that perhaps other folks can understand. No. The answer is no.
Okay.
I would not recuse myself from voting for training dollars that would help folks all across Delaware and the country be better trained for the new economy.
The question
if
is
I
cap
did,
and trade.
Ms. O'Donnell, can you
The
point to
question
any
is-
specific, you have in debates and on your website given 3 different
Yeah.
competing examples. Each time we debate, it's a different technology, it's a different example,
Well, you
and it
stand-
is
there's
hard
an
for me to
article
keep
that-
track
there's an
of which
article
thing
that
you're
was
making
put
up.
out by the Freedomists. I'm trying to see if I brought it up here with me. That very clearly lays out the money, your personal gain, not just from the nearly $1 million that W.L. Gore got from the stimulus, but also from the millions you stand to gain from cap and trade. And these are things that have come from other reporters, not me, and unfortunately I didn't bring
Ms.
it up
O'Donnell,
here.
in the
But
interest
it
of
is
moving
in
us
the
forward,
Freedomist, and it clearly lays it out
the
that
News
you
Journal-
have a lot of personal dollars to be benefited from that. And you brought up the question of experience. You know,
Yes.
you cannot attack
Yes,
that.
I'm going to repeatedly bring up the question of
experience.
experience.
I have more Washington experience than my
You do.
opponent. I
Ms.
have
O'Donnell,
enough Washington
would you share with us
experience to
what you
know-
were advocating for in Washington?
I have enough Washington experience to know how Washington works, but I have enough real-world experience to know how it should work. And that's why I'm asking you to elect someone who will be honest about what we stand to gain in Washington, D.C. I'm asking you to vote for someone who will go to Washington and do what you would do, not what the special interests have asked them to do. As my opponent has a very clear record of caving into special interests, whether it's in county executive or even now on the campaign trail. He puts the political interests ahead of the needs of the Delawareans. Again, I point to the fact that he had the audacity to raise taxes on low-income seniors and low-income disabled.
Ms. O'Donnell,
while
rather than
creating a
simply
slush
quote something
fund
like The
to spend
Freedomist,
money on
I'll
liberal
actually
special
trust the News
interest
Journal
groups.
to sort out which of these things are just flat-out lies, which are fabrications, and which are exaggerations.
And I would ask
So I
people
look
to go
forward
to
to
our
having
website and
the
check
News
out
Journal,
the
which I
fact-checking the
trust
News
as an
Journal's
independent
fact
news
check.
organ of our community, to continue to call you out when you put things out that are just flat-out wrong or wildly
You're
untrue.
encouraging people
And frankly,
to,
Mr. Moderator, I would appreciate some
You're-
help in moving this conversation forward.
Oh, how does it? Wait. Let me just point something out there. Let me just point something out there. When the heat's getting on my opponent, he's calling out for help. But
Ms.
when I
O'Donnell,
debated on
when you
CNN, it was
Ms.
clearly
O'Donnell,
3
when you
against 1.
insist in
So let's-
devolving into a pointless
No, let me-
tirade of baseless personal
No.
attacks, I'm going to
These
say
are not
let's move it
baseless
forward.
Personal attacks. We have everything clearly documented,
Okay.
whether it's the Delaware Department of
Ms. O'Donnell,
Labor showing that
Ms. O'Donnell.
unemployment doubled under your watch. But the reason why you keep pointing to the News Journal is because the reporter who's been assigned to this beat has already publicly supported you, and it makes it very clear who she favors in this. So of course you would say keep pointing to the News Journal. I'm asking the voters to look at the statistics, look at the facts. Look at what we've been putting out there on the website, whether it's coming from the Congressional Budget Office or the Delaware Department of Labor.
Great.
These are not things that I can spin. These are not things that any news journal can spin.
Ms.
Okay,
O'Donnell,
So I'm
then-
asking
then let's
voters to
take
look
two.
at the
Mr. Coons.
facts.
I'll take that challenge.
Respond, and then we're
Ms.
moving on
O'Donnell.
in 30 seconds.
Ms. O'Donnell, on her fact check section of her website, has 2 just fascinating facts. So let's take a moment on those. One of those, to this point, is a suggestion that I and other folks at Gore were lobbying in 2003 for cap-and-trade controls that would benefit Gore dramatically if cap-and-trade were passed. The cap-and-trade legislation, the broader issue, is about climate change. It's about controlling carbon dioxide. It's about a carbon tax, right? That's the essential issue. The technology at stake in 2003 had to do with capturing mercury. Mercury is a fundamentally different pollutant, a fundamentally different technology, and something that Gore abandoned 7 years ago, if you read the article that's linked to on your own website, because the Bush administration wouldn't make progress in reasonable protections to prevent mercury from going into our air, a proven neurotoxin that hurts children. That's one point. It's just factually untrue. Second, in some cases where you exaggerate wildly, you keep suggesting in your ad and on your website and here today that I spent down the entire stimulus, the entire surplus, that I drove the county to the edge of bankruptcy and spent the entire so-called surplus. Just flat out, factually untrue.
The budget by spending the surplus money, and
it's
not
just
according to
flat
me.
out,
It's
factually
according to
untrue.
Well, it's according to other projections that
If
the
you
county
read the
will be
budget
bankrupt by
documents of our
2014.
county government, it's just
not according to
flat
me.
out, factually untrue.
All right, 8:45 here at 11:50 a.m. WDEL. We are live from Widener University School of Law this morning for a candidate debates between Christine O'Donnell and Chris Coons. And in the interest of getting our panelists more involved, Mark Nardone from Delaware Today has the next question.
Peter, can I clarify a point of the format? Are the panelists allowed to interrupt during the crossfire section?
Yes.
We are. I think we've been very well behaved. Thanks.
Well, he's asking for
He's
your
sounding
help, so
cagey.
interrupt. He asked for a lifeline. Guess he can't handle it.
The question's come up many times, but it's the big question, I think. Large employers aren't hiring. Credit's tight, capital's tight for small business and startups. Exactly how do you grow jobs? Specifics, please.
Let's start with Ms. O'Donnell, I guess.
Okay, of course. Now, what I'm proposing specifically to help jumpstart the economy immediately, as I stated to Tamela, number one, make sure that the massive tax increases that we're all about to face in January do not happen, not just for some, but for all, especially the job creators, especially the small business owners who fall under that random earning of $250,000 before they pay a family, for employees, and before they feed their own family. The other thing that I'm proposing is a temporary 2-year tax holiday on the capital gains tax, because although, as my opponent has said, tax cuts are great, a step in the right direction, it's not enough. No small business owner is going to create a $40,000 a year job because this administration gives them a $5,000 tax credit. You create jobs when you have the capital to reinvest in your business. When you reinvest in your business grows. When your business grows, you have to hire people. That's
All right,
how you...
that's time. That's 60.
Okay. I have
60
two
seconds
more.
to you.
Two more.
Thanks for the question, Mark, because I really think that is the question that's on the mind of Delawareans today. There are a whole range of things we can and should do in tax policy, in trade policy, in education, in training, and in infrastructure that will help create jobs in the short term and will make America more competitive in the long term. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've met with and spoken with CEOs of 2 local companies who are threatening to either close or move because they can't get access to capital. I think the administration and the Democrats in Congress made significant progress in providing funding through mid to small-sized banks that will help finance these projects. And the county is continuing to use recovery zone facilities bonds, something the stimulus made possible in these 2 cases to help sustain those companies here and to help them hire more people here. There's a wide range of concrete things we can do, and I'd be grateful to talk about them more in the crossfire section.
Please, Ms. O'Donnell, what would you like to add?
Yes, I'd like to continue on the other 2 things that I would immediately do. 2 things that the voters should be very concerned about, because both of these can come up in the lame duck session, and one of us will be serving in that. Number 1 is the vote on cap and trade. Whether it's MIT or the Heritage Foundation, unilaterally everybody's stating that cap and trade will immediately kill about 6,000 jobs right here in Delaware, and that's something that one of us will be voting on this November. I will not only vote against it, but I will try to convince at least 51 of my colleagues not to pass cap and trade, because Delaware cannot afford to lose 6,000 more jobs. The other thing that I'm proposing to do in this lame duck session, as I briefly mentioned, is to permanently eliminate the death tax. The death tax is something that immediately impacts our farmers. Now, while the government may be the #1 employee here in Delaware, agriculture and farming is a main source of economic stability here. The death tax, which will be reinstated January 1st, will cause many farmers, if they lose a loved one, to also lose their farms. I met someone on the campaign trail who told me that they have a terminally ill grandfather who is literally praying to die before January 1st. That's tragic. No family should have to fear the loss of a business after losing the loss of a loved one. And there's something Congress can do now. Also, by permanently eliminating the death tax, it's projected that we will create 1.5 million jobs because we're going to keep these businesses based in the private sector, not in government spending. So what my opponent is proposing is based on more government spending. In order to sustain it, we will have to continue to raise taxes. The common sense men and women in Delaware, common sense men and women here in this room, know that that is not sustainable. And I would point to the fact that as the stimulus bill that he touts, the Democrats have had control of both Congress and the White House for nearly 2 years, and in their so-called job-creating stimulus bills, we've actually lost 2.5 million jobs.
Ms. O'Donnell's sense of the record and the history
is...
is... Ms. O'Donnell's sense of the actual record in terms of the stimulus, its effect on our economy, and its actual job creation, I think is fundamentally wrong. I also am the only candidate in front of you who has actual experience working in a company, helping to grow and create jobs. Traveling around the country and making a decision. If you would let me speak, I'll actually explain that. I'm traveling around the country with a site location team, deciding where we would expand as a company, deciding where we would purchase land, where we would invest in new facilities, and what sorts of market conditions and incentives would make us decide to locate a new more than $100 million semiconductor chip fab facility in a state. And there's a wide range of things. Tax policy, regulatory policy are critical, but so is the workforce, so is infrastructure, so is access to the marketplace. And there are critical investments we can and should continue to make here in the United States and continue fights to be fought in terms of fair trade to make sure that our competitors, particularly China but others, are not just blatantly counterfeiting American intellectual property and American-based and invented products, to make sure that we've got the infrastructure to grow in the 21st century. We inherited a tremendous infrastructure in this nation after the war. But that infrastructure that was built in the 50s and 60s is badly aging and needs to be revived for the 21st century. I'm talking about job creation and what policies are going to create jobs. And you challenged me to say what experience I had that's related to creating jobs. I've got hands-on experience creating jobs.
The Congressional Budget Office is the one who says we've lost $2.5 million. So,
and the Congressional Budget Office, if you read the report, says that was caused by the market collapse that occurred because of the wild and reckless No. Ms. O'Donnell, your understanding of what caused the collapse in our economy is fundamentally unsound.
Now,
it was wild deregulation of Wall Street that led to the collapse of our economy.
Isn't creating an air filtration system an economic stimulus in itself? Doesn't it ensure at least the security of some jobs?
It has not. You're talking about the stimulus that was
I mean, in general, things like an air filtration system.
If a company does that, they have shareholders that can invest. It is not the taxpayer's responsibility to prop up corporations. The taxpayers give their money to the federal government for a very limited role. Now, as my opponent has So
help me understand, Ms. O'Donnell.
Excuse
would you
me,
oppose the Small Business Administration?
Will you please let me finish?
Let's do this, because clearly you're both interrupting each other, and I understand why. It's a heated debate. You take about another minute. I'm going to give Mr. Coons another minute, then we're going to move on.
Okay.
Thank you.
If you want more of the same, if you want more corporate bailouts and failed stimulus bills that have cost $2.5 million, then vote for my opponent, who is reiterating that he will rubber stamp the Reid-Obama agenda. But it is clearly not working. We need economic policies that will immediately jumpstart the economy, that will immediately see real job creation based on private business, not government handout. The overreaching arm of the federal government is way too big, way too far. Now, if a business has an innovative idea, then they should be able to attract investors. This is called the free market. That's how it works. It's not up to the taxpayers, especially in this economy, to pick and choose which corporation gets to succeed. I don't buy this too big to fail mentality. I don't think the government should be dictating what kind of salaries executives get, should be buying out corporations. We took over GM, and GM still closed their plant. It didn't help the Delaware taxpayers who paid for that.
Let's do 60 seconds to Mr. Coon, and then we'll move on to another question.
Thank you, Peter. My opponent repeatedly weighs in against the overreaching arm of the federal government. The federal government provides critical support in the short term and the long term for our economy and its competitiveness, whether it's the Export-Import Bank, the Department of Commerce's export promotion programs, the Small Business Administration, or lots of other things that our federal government does to constructively support capital formation, market exploration, infrastructure, or exports. I believe that the federal government can and should play a critical role in supporting and sustaining innovative, creative companies that are the key to growing our way out of this recession. My opponent makes it clear she doesn't understand capital formation, the appropriate role of the federal government in helping to grow our economy, or the very real potential for Delaware to benefit from a number of the policies that I'm advocating. Last, my opponent in her tax policy says she will not close the tax loophole that provides incentives for American companies to ship jobs overseas. Her position is clearly different from mine on that. I will end that practice and make sure that we reward and invest in those companies that are growing invention and manufacturing here in Delaware and here in the United States. I can't draw a clear contrast for you in our views about what should happen going forward.
All right, very good. Thank you, Mr. Coons. Coming up near 9 o'clock here on 11:50 a.m. WDEL. Again, you're listening to live coverage of a debate between the U.S. Senate candidates in Delaware, Republican Christine O'Donnell, Democrat Chris Coons, live for Widener University School of Law. Our panelists this morning, Mark Nardone from Delaware Today, Tamela Edwards from ABC 6 Action News, WDEL's own Alan Loudell, and Chad Livengood from the News Journal, and Tamela Edwards. The floor is yours.
All right, we've talked a lot about economic policy in the last few minutes. I'd like to take a turn to social policy, because when you look at Delaware to be such a small state, some stats jump out at you. This state has the 5th highest AIDS rate in the nation and the 6th highest teen birth rate in the nation. What would you as a senator do to fight those statistics?
I think we probably start with Mr. Coons this time.
Yes.
One of the things about the Affordable Care Act that I support is its significant increase in the role and the investment in preventive care, in wellness, and in community health centers. There is a critical role in the nonprofit sector and in the federally funded healthcare sector for outreach and education. HIV/AIDS is a terrible disease that has affected millions of Americans, and we need to push back, both against ignorance and against a lack of appropriate education. Beginning at an early age, families and children need the tools to educate their children and to protect themselves and to have access to confidential and broad testing to make sure that those who are at risk of contracting HIV/AIDS and those who are living with HIV/AIDS have the resources and the support that they need. There's also innovative and appropriate programming that we can provide to reduce both teen pregnancy and low birth weight children. Several administrations here in our state have made real progress in addressing the issue of teen pregnancy and low birth weight babies, and I look forward to addressing that further in the cross discussion.
Ms. O'Donnell, 60 seconds to you.
I think that the best thing we can do is to empower the local organizations. Our government spends so much money on HIV care and research, and that's a good thing. However, in terms of seeing directly those statistics go down, we need to work with the local organizations that are working with the men and women who are impacted by these things for character development, for education, for outreach, to help people become aware of what we can do. Now, it is not the role of the federal government because we are simply too big and too bloated to understand the needs of the individual. So that's why I say this is something very important that should be taking place on the local level, empowering the organizations who do take on those things. When it comes to teen pregnancy, I sat on the board of Birthright, a local organization here in Delaware that addresses that through partnering with young women who have babies out of wedlock to give them what they need, the resources, economics, resources that they need, but not only that, to partner with them and mentor with them so that they can provide a better way of life for themselves.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Donnell. You're listening to 1150 AM, WDEL Wilmington, and WSDW HD3 Wilmington. It's 9 o'clock, and is there anything further we'd like to add on this particular question? Mr. Coons.
I'll simply say that, in my view, one of the most effective and admirable programs, to get back to our earlier conversation about faith-based programs and their possible appropriate role, Bethel AME Church in Wilmington runs a program called Beautiful Gate Ministries, which provides confidential, free HIV testing. So if there's anybody who's listening, I just like to lift them up as an organization that's done a great job at reaching out and trying to tackle this significant problem in our community. We also need to push back against the bigotry that historically has mischaracterized the origins, the causes, the impact of HIV/AIDS. I also frankly think we need to advance education. We need to empower parents to educate their children and to give them age-appropriate and a full range of tools to educate their children to reduce teen pregnancy and to make sure that those teens who do get pregnant get access to quality health care. Part of why I support the Affordable Care Act is its significant increase in preventive care, in wellness, and in supporting for the community health centers, exactly the sort of centers, whether it's Westside Health or other health centers in our community that have made a great impact in affecting all three of the issues that we're talking about.
Ms. O'Donnell, a final thought before we move on? Okay. WDEL's Alan Loudell. The question is yours.
The United States has formally declared war against foreign nations 5 separate times in our history, but not with recent wars. Depending on how you look at the Constitution, constitutional liberalism, etc., should a president be able to wage war without a formal congressional declaration of war? Or in another way, are you satisfied with the current system where the president asserts the constitutional authority to commit troops without the need for congressional approval, but the president gets congressional authorization that satisfies the provisions of the War Powers Act?
Ms. O'Donnell, 1 minute to you.
It is true with 4 panelists and 2 people, the same person gets the question. So, no problem with that.
I thought that Mr. Coons had responded first last time. No?
Yeah. Yes.
Not to my question. That's true.
What?
Want to flip a coin for it? I don't really,
No, I think that's
just
fair.
make a judgment call about which one.
Tally, I've been answering first on the majority of them, but it's going to be no different when I stand up in the U.S. Senate and have to go against my leadership and the party leadership. So I'm used to opposition, but I think out of fairness, we'll shoot this one to Coons.
I will say I admire my opponent's persistent willingness to take on and fight everyone, including the panel, me, our institutions.
60 seconds.
Mr. Liddell, I think your question, Mr. Liddell, had to do with the War Powers Act and whether I believe it's appropriate for presidents to conduct war or operations close to war without congressional authorization. I think it is critical and enshrined in our Constitution that the Congress continue to play an appropriate oversight role. And in the cases where we've gone most badly off track in terms of the conduct of our military, it's where congressional oversight was only exercised long after the fact and where clear rules of engagement and a clear scope for the mission wasn't laid out at the outset. Obviously, in moments of crisis, in response to an attack on the United States, in moments when the supreme commander of our armed forces needs to act decisively and promptly, there may not be time for a broad congressional inquiry into the appropriateness of war, the scope of the war. But as a senator, I would repeatedly act to hold the president accountable, a president of either party, for their conduct of a war, for their conduct of foreign affairs, to make sure that they are in keeping with our most fundamental values and that they're effective in keeping us safe.
Very good. Ms. O'Donnell, 60 seconds to you.
I think when it comes to officially declaring a war, you're setting a whole new tone that may not always be necessary when our national interests are threatened. For the question of when should we use force, it's any time that our national interest is threatened. Specifically, what's on the voters' minds right now is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the staging area for 9/11. It definitely impacted our national security, and we definitely had to respond with force. My opponent has said that he supports a random time withdrawal. I do not support that. He says that it's because he thinks that creating stability over there is unrealistic. Well, that's what his party said about Iraq. And because we are consistent and persistent and supported our men and women who are serving over there and risking their lives, we have seen stability and we have created a more safe environment. I think that if we randomly withdraw out of Afghanistan right now, we're simply going to embolden the terrorists to come after us even harder because we have not seen the benchmarks that need to be in place in Afghanistan before we leave.
All right, very good. Mr. Coons, anything further?
Ms. O'Donnell, would you just, one more time for us, lay out what those benchmarks are for success in Afghanistan?
Absolutely.
I think that's helpful.
We need to see a representative government that serves the needs of the people and that is able to defend itself. We were working in Afghanistan to defeat the Soviets in the 80s, and we left without seeing these things created. And that's why Afghanistan became a vacuum for terrorism and a staging ground for 9/11. We cannot leave without finishing what we started. It happened when we left without finishing the job in the 80s, and we paid a price on 9/11. We cannot do that. You can stand there and politically correct, rubber stamp the foreign policy agenda coming from your party, but that does not do a service to the people here in Delaware who are concerned about their security, who are concerned about their safety. We need to support our troops.
Ms.
We need
O'Donnell.
to strengthen our military. Our military has to be feared once again by rogue nations and terrorists. They need to know that we are serious about defending our people, about defending our homeland, and that the threat of military action actually means something again. If we allow these terrorists to chase us out of Afghanistan like you want to do, you're putting every single person here in this room at risk. How dare you give into political correctness like that?
Ms. O'Donnell, that makes a great speech. It's a nice slogan, but there's no substance behind it whatsoever. I would take you far more seriously if I had ever seen you at a deployment ceremony for the Delaware National Guard, at a homecoming ceremony for the Delaware National Guard.
I don't turn these things
Ms. O'Donnell,
into photo ops.
Ms. O'Donnell, they are not. Ms. O'Donnell,
I support
Ms.
our
O'Donnell,
military, and I do not do it for the glory of a
Ms.
campaign
O'Donnell.
trail.
Okay, let's have Mr. Coons respond before we move on to another question.
Ms. O'Donnell, you have just laid out a position on Afghanistan that is reckless and irresponsible, a standard which we will not meet.
It is reckless and irresponsible to pull out before the job is done and our people are safe.
How many
It is
years,
putting the
Ms.
lives
O'Donnell,
at-
do
it
you
is
imagine it will
making a
take
mockery of those
to
who are
build a
putting their
modern
lives at
nation
risk?
out of Afghanistan? Because frankly, the men and women of our armed forces, the men and women of Delaware, who have served and continue to serve honorably a decade in Afghanistan, have no clear end in sight if the objectives and goals are as you stated. Iraq and
that's what
Afghanistan are
then
fundamentally
Senator
different countries.
Barack Obama said about Iraq. But because
Afghanistan
men
and
women
Iraq are
willingly
fundamentally different
re-enlisted
countries.
specifically
Afghanistan
to go over
lacks
there.
anything like the infrastructure of a modern nation. And despite our best efforts, hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of lives, we have not succeeded in
So
Afghanistan,
you're
as we
saying
have in
that we
Iraq,
should
in standing up a modern
continue
nation.
to
As you
use
have
the
defined
Afghan
the
people
goals,
at our
we will
interest
not
and
achieve that
help
objective.
them.
So, Ms.
So you're
O'Donnell,
saying-
I
so-
think what you're doing is simply yelling empty rhetoric rather than laying out responsible
Well, let me
objectives
ask you
for
then.
our armed
Let me
forces
ask you.
overseas.
So
And
you're
to send
saying
our
it's
men and
okay-
women on a
so
mission
you're saying-
with no
One moment,
clear
please,
end in
candidates.
sight is not responsible.
So you're saying
One
then-
moment, please. One moment, please.
I don't think
No,
we
go.
answered Alan's question.
Correct.
And I want to back up just a second. I think when the War Powers Act was conceived, we were going to war with nations.
Right.
I don't know if it's been invoked or not invoked in the case of going to war against Al-Qaeda, if we can formally call it a war. But if the commander-in-chief
Well, the
can
war-
authorize military force like that, could they do the same, in your opinion, of someone like a Mexican drug lord?
Well, what we're going after right now, as we were talking about in Afghanistan, is the war on terror. Many nations have been used as safe havens for terrorists, so it's difficult to actually identify one nation. So when we use force, it is where a specific nation has put our national interest at jeopardy. So in this particular battle, for our security, it's difficult to declare which nation it would be that we are in war with. But to get back to Afghanistan, I mean, I need to ask my opponent.
Mr. Nardone,
if
to
he
answer your
thinks it was
question,
right.
there was a specific congressional authorization of the use of force against terrorists. And because of the novel type and structure of the threat we face today, I think that was an appropriate congressional act because we're not fighting against the structured army of an existing nation. The challenge, as our exchange just highlights, is that in the state of Afghanistan, there is no modern nation state, and there hasn't been for decades. And as then President Bush said in his candidacy, the United States has a real challenge if what we're going to take on is nation building rather than fighting terrorists to make our country more safe. We are engaged in a decades-long effort in Afghanistan. I don't think that's in the best interest of this country.
So
I
are
think
you
we should be
saying what we
fighting
did-
terrorists, not trying to build a modern nation.
Okay, so let me clarify. When we, through covert operations, supplied the people of Afghanistan with weapons to fight the Soviet Union because we were in a Cold War, the Soviet Union was one of our weapons, or one of our enemies, you are saying it was okay to do what we did. Do you know what we did then? I mean, it was, so you're saying it's okay.
I'd be
Was
happy to
that
have you
okay?
join the panel if you'd like. That
My
might help
question
you
is to
focus
you,
your
Chris.
question.
My question is
I
to you.
support Ms.
Was
O'Donnell.
it okay what we did after
Your
supplying
question doesn't make
covert-
sense, Ms. O'Donnell.
If you know what's going on in Afghanistan,
Ms.
my
O'Donnell, you
question
thought
makes
we were
perfect
fighting the
sense.
Soviets in the 90s the last time we faced each other. I'm not sure you're clear what decade this happened
No, that's
in.
not true.
Yes,
Do
look
you,
at the tape.
Mr. Coons,
Can I jump in?
is it okay?
Please.
It'd be
to-
great if the
uh,
panel would
Mr.
ask the question.
If you'll
Mr.
notice, he
Donald,
does not
one
answer the
second.
difficult questions.
Quite honestly, nobody's
Of
answered
course
my
I
colleague's
supported
question
our
yet, so let
actions
me
against the
redefine it and put
Soviets.
it out there again. I think really what he was asking is, we now have a new template. If you're not fighting a nation, you're fighting an organization. Can this spread? Can we turn to Mexico and say, this poor boater who was shot right there on the coast, we're coming in after that person. Where are the borders of this new policy, given how
Right.
we have prosecuted
I
this
think
war
we
against
both
the
did.
Taliban and
I-
Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, I think we both did answer that question in terms of the power lies in the Congress, and the Congress votes on whether or not that active force is to protect our national interests. So I think we are actually in agreement in that, because the threats to our nation have become, so random in terms of it's not a specific nation. The terrorists aren't acting on behalf of a specific nation. Now, if you said a boater, if that was an act of aggression that they did on behalf of Mexico, and we can prove that they were charged with this on behalf of Mexico, then that might be a situation where the president can declare war. But if there's, I'm not saying the president should declare war on the boater. I mean, I just want to clarify that. I'm saying when these groups act on behalf of a government that represents a country that has acted as a hostile act towards us.
In the interest of time, Mr. Coons, let's get a final remark from you on this, and then we're going to move on, because we have closing arguments coming up in about 10 or 12 minutes.
There is a critical, ongoing congressional oversight role in making sure that in this modern environment where we are fighting less against nation states and more against loosely affiliated terrorist groups around the world, to make sure that we do so in a way that protects us as a nation and a people against terrorist attack, but also respects our most fundamental rights. And where I think the previous administration and those in Congress of both parties got off track was in failing to exercise sufficient oversight to make sure that we didn't get outside the boundaries of our core values. When we conduct ourselves in war in a way that violates our international commitments or that violates our most basic principles as a nation, we give help to terrorists who would discredit us as a country. I think we need to fight harder than ever for the core values and the basic rights of this nation. I will strongly support our armed forces, and I'll support the president in his commander-in-chief role of whichever party, but I will hold him accountable, him or her accountable, for conducting our foreign affairs in the future in a way that respects our most fundamental rights, because in my view, that ultimately is what will make us most safe as a country and will most help us have the strong multilateral relationships around the world, a network of allies in the war on terror with us that we need to sustain in order to be successful in the long term.
Our next question comes from Chad Livengood from the News Journal.
Okay, I don't want to get bogged down in a quagmire here, so I got 2 quick questions, both of you separate, if that's okay. This shouldn't take long. Ms. O'Donnell, last month your campaign opened a campaign office here in Brandy 100. Is your campaign still paying a portion of the rent of your townhome in Greenville for a campaign office?
60 seconds.
Yeah, we still use that as an office, and our staff still lives there. Your newspaper grossly mischaracterized what those campaign funds are being used for, as have my opponent's ads. We house many of our staffers who come from downstate because they work long hours, and those funds are used to pay for that housing. We run our office out of the townhouses in Greenville, and we have a main headquarters in which our volunteers come to stuff envelopes, do phone banking, and everyone's welcome to come visit it.
Okay, Mr. Coons, as county executive or in your time on county council, did you ever eliminate or vote to get rid of a tax exemption for seniors, as your opponent alleges?
In my current role as county executive, we asked for a financial future task force to review all the different tax exemptions and all the different sources of revenue and expenses in county government. One of the recommendations they made was that we apply a residency requirement because thousands of seniors had retired to Newcastle County and were taking advantage of a tax exemption that had been expanded as the very last act of my predecessor. We did not advance that proposal. Councilman Smiley did the next year, and a majority of council voted for it, and I signed it into law. So what it imposed was, on those seniors who are earning less than $50,000 a year, it decreased the amount of the home value that they could exempt from property tax and imposed a residency requirement, if I remember correctly. It's a complicated matter. The punchline is, in trying to resolve our financial challenges as a county, I asked an independent board of folks from the Chamber of Commerce to organized labor, people with previous public sector experience and private sector experience, to look at all the different programs in Newcastle County that were either raising revenue or costing us money. They made a specific recommendation to ensure that the senior property tax exemption was targeted at those who needed it, and amendments were later made to that program to reduce its cost in terms of the county and to ensure that those who were low income still were able to benefit from the exemption.
Mark Nardone from Delaware Today.
Are we allowed to respond or comment, crosstalk?
We can. I question how constructive it will be in this particular approach, and I would like to get in one more question before we go to closing argument. So if it's okay with you.
2 more Tamela's going to.
On CNN last week, Mr. Coons, you cited air quality as our biggest environmental problem. And Ms. O'Donnell, you cited the need for regulatory reform. Can you just amplify your positions on that a bit, please?
Mark, who answered your question first last time? Do you remember?
I'll answer. I don't mind. Well, what I meant by regulatory reform is going up and down the campaign trail. I have been listening to many voters, unlike my opponent who said to Politico he never hears people complain about the tax burden. That's a quote in Politico. I have heard people complain about the tax burden. And I've heard senior citizens, low income, who are not taking advantage of the system, but who are concerned about their utility bills going up, and specifically about regulatory reform. I've talked to farmers who want to put in solar panels or some sort of alternative energy source that would make them independent. However, our federal regulations then require that these farms, because of how much energy they produce, will then be taxed at the same rate as a utility company. Now, the purpose of moving towards, is that one that I have, I'm done? Basically, it's on how much energy they produce as opposed to whether or not they sell it, and that prohibits them from exploring alternative energy sources and investing into their own farms.
Thank you very much. Mr. Coons, 1 minute to you.
Mark, Delaware sits in a place in the United States where we are on the receiving end of a lot of air pollution generated across the rest of the country. And I believe it has real, measurable, demonstrated impacts on infant health, on the health of many Delaware citizens. I think it is partly at cause for our unduly high cancer rate, and it's something that Senator Carper has made a real effort at over the last decade to advocate effectively for stronger and tougher air quality regulations that will protect not just Delaware, but all the people of the United States. There are lots of emissions that come out of coal-fired power plants and other power sources. There's lots of emissions that come out of lightly regulated small things like lawnmowers and gas-powered motors that I think we could do a better and stronger job of setting environmental targets, helping move towards them over the longer term, and ensuring that we protect the health of our citizens.
Would anybody like to add anything further on this topic? We can squeeze in one more question. Tamela Edwards came an awful long way to be here this morning. Go ahead, Tamela. Why don't you?
As you know, your state is made up of citizens from so many different kinds of racial, religious, ethnic backgrounds, and that's where this question comes from. One of our allies, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, made big news this weekend by saying that multiculturalism, in her words, had utterly failed, that all citizens there now need to speak German and hew to Christian values. Looking at Delaware and America, is multiculturalism something we should continue to honor and work to include in our public life or not?
60 seconds to Mr. Coons.
Absolutely. Respecting the full range of the backgrounds that people have come from and are bringing to the table to participate in the American body politic is an important part of my values, of our tradition as a nation, and I think of where we're going to go moving forward. I think we need to, in our public schools, in our political debate, in our economy going forward, ensure that we give the greatest possible access to opportunity and the greatest possible opportunity to contribute to our public dialogue and to moving our community and our culture forward to folks no matter what their background or no matter what their, as you put it, race, religion, orientation, or educational experience. That way we will continue to be the beacon of opportunity that I deeply believe in and that we always have been and that we can and should be in the future.
Mr. Coons, thank you. And 60 seconds to you, Ms. O'Donnell.
Yes, I think multiculturalism is definitely something that we need to celebrate. Now, specifically on those remarks, where it would come into the powers of Congress or an issue that I may have to vote on as your next U.S. Senator, is that I would support English being the official language. I think that when it comes to multiculturalism, the best way to help people to truly take advantage of the fact that America is a beacon of freedom, hope, and justice, and I have never questioned that, is to help them assimilate, to help them get a job, and that can be seen through our education system if we teach them English. Yeah, I don't think that anyone would oppose whether multiculturalism is a bad thing. I don't think it is. I think that we truly are a melting pot, and that's what makes America great.
Mr. Coons, anything to add on this?
No, I think we've covered it. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll probably be into the final question here. I'll just warn you, I may have to cut the dialogue short after the fact, but since we have the time, let's one more question from WDEL's Alan Loudell.
Oh, I'm debating what to ask. Okay, healthcare. To what extent have either one of you had to pay out of pocket for your own health care, and how has that informed your view on health care?
A great non-controversial topic. Thank you, Alan. I mean, my wife and I take advantage of the medical savings accounts, an important provision in current law and something that I hope we will continue to expand and defend, that allows us to use pre-tax dollars to pay for things that are not covered by our health insurance. With 3 young children, like many families, we face dental care costs or we face eye care costs that are not covered under current health insurance. And I do think we need to continue to provide vehicles for folks to save for and to finance and to provide for health care coverage or health-related costs that are not covered under either employer-provided insurance or as we move forward under the Affordable Care Act in broader coverage that's available. I think we have to be mindful of the fact that individuals have lots of different circumstances and lots of different challenges in paying for and providing health care. I think we can and should continue to move forward as a country in providing access to quality, affordable health care to as many Americans as is responsibly possible.
All right, I believe the final 60 seconds now will go to Ms. O'Donnell.
I pay for all of my medical costs out of pocket, and I support also the medical savings account. I'd like to point out that Obamacare, which my opponent is in full support of, severely jeopardizes medical savings accounts and businesses' ability to provide that benefit. So because I know what it's like to have to pay for medical expenses out of your own pocket, I have consistently said on the campaign trail that no one disputes whether or not we need health care reform, but somewhere along the course of public debate, we've begun to confuse coverage with care. And what Congress should be doing is addressing the things that make affordable health care accessible to even our most vulnerable in society. Under Obamacare, we were promised that health care costs would go down, but indeed they've gone up. We were promised that more people would have access to insurance, but according to the census, indeed more people are left without insurance. So that's why when it comes to health care, I'm proposing reform based on the private sector that allows the consumer to have the choice, whether it's to continue out-of-pocket costs with lower care because we've addressed...
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to be so abrupt with you. But the clock rules, and it is 9:24 here at WDEL's Commute with the Candidates, and it's time now for our closing statements from the candidates. We had a coin toss you may have seen take place at the beginning of the debate, and Mr. Coons will go first. You have 2 minutes, Mr. Coons.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you to our panel, and thank you again to Widener Law School. Thank you to WDEL and to everyone who's made possible this debate today. It's great to be with you again here at Widener. And I appreciate your close attention to today's debate. Thank you to the panel for the tough questions you've asked and the open and good conversation we've had over the last 90 minutes. I think you've heard there is a clear and real difference between my opponent and me in our values, in our experience, and in our approach to how to get our country, our economy back on track. Ms. O'Donnell does have experience in running for office, but not in really running anything, at delivering great and catchy slogans, but not at delivering on real solutions. And in her decade in Washington, she has great experience at sharpening the partisan divide, but not at bridging it and finding real solutions. I think what Delaware needs and what Delaware deserves is a next United States Senator who has real, hands-on, practical experience solving real problems, fixing what's wrong, capable of tackling what's wrong in Washington, and moving us forward here in Delaware and in our country. And I believe I offer you real and concrete ideas based on this experience. I am the only candidate on this stage today with experience working in the private sector and working with the private sector. And while we've discussed lots of important issues facing our nation going forward, it's clear to me that fixing the economy, helping small businesses create jobs is the most pressing concern facing our families, facing our country, and that's what I will be focused on as your next U.S. Senator. Ideas matter. I've taken the idea to develop them, to post them in full on the website, and to continue to talk about them day in and day out as a candidate for the last 9 months. I'm grateful for the members of the press who are holding my opponent accountable for the things that she said and for the misrepresentations she's made, and I have done my best and will continue to do my best to lay out positive, concrete, and specific ideas for how to move forward. What matters most is getting America back on track. I take seriously the idea this is a job interview, and I want to go to Washington to work for you, for Delaware. I'd be grateful for your vote on November 2nd. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coons. 2 minutes to Ms. O'Donnell for her closing remarks.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. I do believe that there is a clear choice in this debate. As my opponent said, this is a job interview, and on a job interview, you're expected to answer all the questions. My opponent can't name the 5 freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment. He wouldn't tell you whether or not that he thinks what we did in Afghanistan in the 80s was the right thing to do. When the pressure got hot, called for a lifeline. Is this what you want in your next U.S. Senator? I'm not a Democrat, but I know that what we see coming from this administration is not what my Democrat friends voted for when they voted for Hope and Change in 2008. And that's why we have numerous Democrats not only voting for me, but working on my team, because they don't want to see more of the same. My opponent is addicted to a culture of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that is seen in how he has run our county government. Whether it's raising taxes on the most vulnerable in our society, saying that low-income seniors and low-income disabled are taking advantage of our system is just heartless. And then to run our county to a position where it's going to be bankrupt by 2014, we do not need more of the same. We do not need someone who is going to rubber stamp the failed policies coming from Washington. But I believe that we can get our country back on track. I believe that we can be strong again. I have never questioned whether America is a beacon of freedom and hope. And I will stand up to the party pressure in Washington, D.C., and put your interests ahead of Washington interests. So if you want someone with the experience to go to Washington and serve, to take the commitment to represent the interests of the people and not the special interests, then I'm asking for your vote. Because I believe what we need to do to get the economy back on track is to create policies that spur the economy through the private business. As I said, your next U.S. Senate will be voting on very important issues this November. The massive tax increases that are going to be coming this January, cap and trade that is immediately going to raise your utility bills by $1,200. In just 3 years alone, we are going to be paying $1 billion. It's time?
That's time.
In interest alone on our national debt. It's got to stop.
Well, that concludes WDEL's Compete with the Candidates this morning, a debate between Delaware U.S. Senate candidates Christine O'Donnell and Chris Coons. How about a nice round of applause for our candidates this morning? Thank you so much. Also, we'd like to thank everyone for turning out here. A packed house today. That was great at the Widener University School of Law. Also to Widener staff, Dean Linda Ammons, Mary Allen, and the technical folks here who make sure that our equipment works, along with our engineers for this broadcast, Lee St. John and Dave Valet. Of course, we thank our panelists, Tamela Edwards from Channel 6, Mark Nardone from Delaware Today, Chad Livengood from the News Journal, and WDEL's Alan Loudell. Your questions help us learn more about these candidates and where they stand on the issues, and we thank you for that. Later today, you can see a podcast of this debate on our website, WDEL.com. Also video there.